Okay, we I guess technically got started already. Those of you who are listening live to us, we're pleased to officially kind of get started here. It's great to see so many alumni and alumnae on the call today for this very special program as part of our virtual reunion, our first virtual reunion. And given the success that we've had, perhaps we will do this moving forward to some extent as well. My name is Jeff Shantz. I'm the Vice President for Institutional Advancement here at Albany Law School, and we are really thrilled to have this session here at noontime here on the East Coast for our thought leaders with Professor Ray Brescia and Mr. David Beier, class of 1973. I'm going to introduce the panelists and just make a note that we are recording this session so that we can send this out to all of our audiences afterwards. And we will be monitoring the Q&A and the chat for questions for the panelists as we get going. But first, I'd like to introduce Mr. David Beier, class of 1973. Mr. Beier is the Managing Director of Bay City Capital, located in San Francisco, California. He is a globally recognized leader in healthcare policy, pricing, intellectual property, government affairs, regulatory affairs, healthcare economics, and product commercialization. Mr. Beier served in the White House as the Chief Domestic Policy Advisor to Vice President Al Gore during the Clinton administration. He has served as an appointee of President Bill Clinton on the Institute of Medicine panel on the future of health and human services. Mr. Beier was also formerly a partner in international law firm of Hogan and Hartson, and was formerly counsel to the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on the Judiciary. In addition, he previously served on the study committee of the National Academy of Sciences on genome editing. He has testified before Congress and the Federal Trade Commission, has written numerous law review articles and technical legal works, is regularly invited to author expert op-eds on healthcare and recently COVID vaccines, genome editing, and artificial intelligence. He has contributed to books on topics ranging from intellectual property, trade privacy, and justice issues. Mr. Beier is a member of the Board of Directors of the California Life Science Association and the University of California, San Francisco, Benioff Children's Hospital. He currently serves as an appointee of Governor Brown on the California State Government Organization and Economy Commission. He also serves on the Board of Directors at Infinity Pharmaceuticals Incorporated. It serves as an advisor to Facebook on healthcare issues and W2O on communication matters. The most important part of the bio, David, I'm sure you will agree, he received a JD from Albany Law School, and his undergraduate degree is at Colgate. Mr. Beier, we're really pleased to have you here. Thank you very much for participating. We are also going to introduce our Professor Ray Brescia, the Honorable Harold R. Tyler Chair in Law and Technology and Professor of Law at Albany Law School. Professor Brescia, who joined the faculty at Albany Law in 2007, combines his experience as a public interest attorney in New York City with his scholarly interests to address economic and social inequality, the legal and policy implications of financial crises, of innovative legal and regulatory approaches can improve economic and community development efforts, and the need to expand access to justice for people of low and moderate income. Before coming to Albany Law, he was the Associate Director of the Urban Justice Center in New York City, where he coordinated legal representation for community-based institutions in areas such as housing, economic justice, workers' rights, civil rights, and environmental justice. He also serves as an adjunct professor at New York Law School from 1997 through 2006. Prior to his work at the Urban Justice Center, he was a staff attorney at New Haven Legal Assistance and the Legal Aid Society of New York, where he was a recipient of the Skadden Fellowship after graduation from law school. Professor Brescia also served as a law clerk to the path-breaking civil rights attorney turned federal judge, the Honorable Constance Baker Motley, Senior U.S. District Court Judge for the Southern District of New York. While a student at Yale Law School, Professor Brescia was a co-recipient of the Charles Alborn Prize for Appellate Advocacy, was a student director of several clinics, including the Allard K. Lowenstein International Human Rights Law Clinic and the Homelessness Clinic, and was visiting lecturer at Yale College. We are very pleased to have Professor Brescia with us today, And I'll turn it over now to David to begin the panel. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to participate in an Albany Law School event. I know that everyone regrets not having the opportunity to be there in person and to visit with your classmates and other colleagues from the law school. I have to say on a personal note that I couldn't be more pleased at the progress Albany Law School has made in recent years, both in terms of its direction, its vision, and its ability to attract high quality dean and really high quality professors. So today is just an example of the dramatic changes that at least I see from a distance in the Albany Law School. And the opportunity to talk with Ray about his book is really an expansion of what the concept of teaching and research involves. In Ray's case, he worked with students and other faculty members to put together an amazing piece of research. And unlike a lot of law professors in the past, he's tried to make it useful in the form of a book, done a number of podcasts, essentially tried to disseminate the ideas that he put together as a professor. And that's really quite impressive and very much to the credit of people from Albany Law School. So let's begin, Ray. I want to start with maybe the most practical thing. So you have a bunch of students and you want to have them come away from the end of their education knowing something about technology and the law and how it affects their clients. In a minute or two, what lesson should they take away from your book? Why do they need to know about the history of technology and how it's changed social movements? How's that relevant if you're practicing law in Rochester or in Kinderhook?
That's a great question. You said I have an hour or two to respond, right? But thank you. That's a great question, and sort of the point of the book is really to give people tools to understand the role that technology plays in social change, and to the extent that lawyers are engaged in social change, and they often are. I've tried to give folks a sort of playbook for the use of technology to advance social change. But before I get into that, just thank you, David, for agreeing to be a part of this, and thank you for everyone at the law school for making this event possible. And hopefully I'll get a chance later on to thank everybody for making the book possible. But I have to note, I'm looking out my window, and this may be one of those 1 or 2 days of the year where Albany and San Francisco weather kind of match, where it's about 69 degrees and sunny, bluish sky. But yeah, this sort of mid-September and sort of mid-May, where San Francisco and Albany kind of match up weather-wise. But we've got a great day here in the capital region. So the goal of the book was really to look at the relationship between technology and social movements, and how the two come together. And if you're an advocate today, if you're a lawyer interested in advancing social change, I'd like to think that you have to be aware of the role that technology can play in advancing social change. I go into a couple of different examples in the book where folks were able to harness the most recent technology available to them today, social media and the internet, for example, to advance social change. One of the case studies I use in the book is the example of a minimum wage effort in Long Beach, California, in Southern California, where advocates were looking to raise the minimum wage for hotel workers in the community, and they used the technology, social media, to raise awareness about the issue, but also to raise allies, to gather allies. They used a social media campaign that was actually modeled on an American Express campaign, which was Small Business Saturdays. And the idea that the advocates had was, if the hotel workers, who most of whom lived in the community, had more money in their pockets, they were likely to spend that money locally and to help boost small businesses. And so who would benefit from that? Well, certainly the workers would benefit from that, but also the small businesses would benefit from that. And residents in the community who wanted to see their community thrive would benefit from that. And so the advocates, which were mostly a union, the hotel workers union there, aligned with otherwise unlikely allies like small business owners and homeowners associations to spread the word using social media and traditional media to raise awareness and gather support. And so they were able to do that. They focused on what Derek Bell would call interest convergence, the sharing of interests in more money being spent in the community, and gather these unlikely allies to support the local ballot initiative to raise the wages of hotel workers in the community. And they succeeded spectacularly. They won over 60% of the vote. The only regret they had was that they didn't ask for more because the support was so strong. And they chalked that up to the fact that they were able to gather these unlikely allies together, often using technology to raise awareness, to spread clever hashtags, as well as more analog efforts like going to community meetings, going to meetings of block associations and homeowners associations, going literally door to door in business districts, trying to get small business owners to support their efforts. So a core component, I think, of the advocacy of all of the case studies, and we can get into other case studies as well, is that they use technology creatively, but they also do other things well. And we can talk about some of those other things. So from a perspective of a lawyer who wants to utilize technology to advance social change, you have to understand how the technology works for sure. You have to understand the risks associated with it, the security risks that may be associated with it, but also, I hope, learn from the past, from creative efforts to advance social change using present technology, but also older technologies as well. And that's what the book tries to do.
Okay, I want to come back to that in a while, but you and I have quite a big age difference, but we also have some common career components. I was a legal services lawyer early in my legal career, and it was the era in the 1970s of change through litigation. The law reform idea was go forth, litigate, win rights, game, set, match. And I think what we didn't recognize at the time has now become true, and that's a thesis of your book, which is that you can't just litigate. And particularly today with the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg lying in state at the Supreme Court, in the context of LGBTQ rights, she's commented on the necessity of social acceptance of gay, lesbian rights in communities, then in states, in order to make it feasible, socially and politically feasible for the court to recognize legal rights. And this seems to be a bit of a theme in your book, that is the overlap or congruence between social movements and litigation. So if you were the proverbial lawyer, you graduated 10 or 20 years ago, you're going to be confronting an evolving legal landscape. And so the proponents of change, whether it's conservative or liberal, are going to use tools to try and create a social consensus in parallel to whatever the litigation is. Is that a fair summary of what one of the things you're trying to get across?
Absolutely right. And so, one of the periods I discuss in the book is this sort of quite dramatic shift in the shape of social movements and social advocacy groups after sort of the sort of high water mark, if you would, of the civil rights movement in the mid 60s. They win the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 and the Fair Housing Act of 68. Other groups that wanted to advocate for other populations looked at those victories and said, we want what they've got, right? We want to have an advocacy effort that brings about these sorts of dramatic changes. But interestingly, at that same moment, there's a big shift in the technology that is available to groups that want to bring about social change. And so the civil rights movement was very much focused on local chapters, local organizing. They would bring in the big guns for big campaigns, but they worked through newspapers, they worked through local radio, they certainly harnessed the television. That was one of the great coups, was their ability to use the printed images and images beamed over television sets of children being attacked by dogs, having water hoses put on them, John Lewis on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So they had a sort of a multimedia campaign that helped raise awareness, change hearts and minds, and build support for this landmark legislation. The groups that sort of formed in their wake emerged in many respects at the same time that a new technology came on the scene. And that technology was the ability to engage in mass mailings, computerized mailing lists. And so groups sort of separated from that grassroots organizing model that was complemented by the technology. And in some ways, the technology became a means to it became the end of the advocacy and not just a means to the end. If people saw the terrific show on, I think it's on Hulu, Mrs. America, and in that, the Phyllis Schlafly's mailing list, computerized mailing list, is almost a character in the show, and towards the end, she delivers on a floppy disk her mailing list, because that's what her advocacy was about, gathering as many people together to combat the ERA. And a lot of groups during that period used that model and really got away from the grassroots organizing model designed to change hearts and minds. And I think what I try to highlight in the book is groups that are moving back towards that sort of hearts and mind model. And one of the examples, you alluded to it, is the marriage equality campaign. And I focus on a ballot referendum again in 2012 in Maine, and talk about the real grassroots effort in Maine, which was one of several states in 2012 that had a ballot referendum around marriage equality. And the advocates went door to door in Maine, a rural state. It's not so easy to go door to door, but they did. They had hundreds of thousands of conversations, just conversations, meaningful conversations, that some of which would last 20, 30 minutes to help people think about their support or their opposition to marriage equality, and try to convince people and put a sort of human face to the struggle for marriage equality. And that campaign was incredibly successful. In 2009, they had lost a ballot initiative in Maine. Just 3 years later, they win the ballot initiative, and that's one of the sort of pieces of the struggle for marriage equality, where individual conversations, local efforts, local campaigns, statewide campaigns help to build a groundswell of support that it took decades to get the Supreme Court to Obergefell, but it ultimately got there because of this broad grassroots effort. And that's something that people who want to advance social change, it's a great case study in how to do that. You don't just launch these massive lawsuits without doing the groundwork of support that can take decades, as the marriage equality campaign did.
Yeah, for listeners who want to go deeper into Ray's story, there's a really, really good book about the history and insights in the U.S. Constitution by Jill Lepore, a historian from Harvard, called These Truths. And it has a very compelling story in there about Phyllis Schlafly. And so I think part of the reason for raising the two things together is that the technology tools aren't inherently good and they're not inherently evil. They're tools, and they can be applied in a variety of different ways. And my own life journey, I've been an advocate for ending gun violence for several decades, and I was on the board of a advocacy group, and it was formed largely around mailing lists. And that's how we raised money, and that's what we thought was going to be successful. And so the assault weapon ban in the early 90s was a product of a lot of mailing lists, and that was sort of the tool of the day. And then things turned around the year 2000 to the Million Mom March, which was my term astroturf. It wasn't deep enough in community organizing. There were just a lot of people. And it took another generation, some money from Mike Bloomberg and some advocacy by former Congresswoman Giffords, to put together the community organizing. The thing that eventually broke through was local chapters and state chapters using social media to raise money and to organize. And frankly, mailing lists became completely irrelevant. So technology evolves over time with respect to whatever the social movement is. Well, Ray, I want to take you back in history a little bit. So would it be a fair statement to say that the printing press was the first and most powerful example of the dissemination of knowledge and therefore social disruption in terms of its effect on the Catholic Church and on the hierarchy in European government? And just spin that out a little bit.
Yeah, so the book focuses mostly on, almost exclusively on the United States, and there certainly are other analysts who've looked at the role of the printing press in the Glorious Revolution in England. I really start with the printing press in the United States. And around the 1750s, early 1750s, there's just a few printing presses in the colonies, and they're mostly based in coastal cities. And it wasn't until the early 1760s that you start to see more printing presses, and then you start to see a partisan printing press begin to emerge. And then the Stamp Act crisis really was quite a galvanizing event. Yeah.
Okay, some of us remember the Stamp Act because we were alive then, but others maybe, what was the Stamp Act? Where did it come from?
Sure.
It was a tax on, right?
Yeah, so the Crown, in an effort to raise money for the debt it incurred in fighting the French and Indian War in the colonies, decides it's going to tax the printers essentially, and virtually everything they do, even law licenses, anything a printer prints is going to be taxed. And, you know, as you would imagine, that galvanized printers to oppose the Stamp Act. And they're the voice of the colonies. And you think about who those people are. Well, it's names you know, like Sam Adams and Ben Franklin. I mean, these were prominent people who had a platform and could articulate a opposition and spread word about that opposition. We often think of the Sons of Liberty and, you know, the Tea Party and all that. Well, the Sons of Liberty formed around the Stamp Act, opposing the Stamp Act. And so the opposition was very strong to the Stamp Act. There were, you know, the tax collectors were threatened. There was a lot of fear in England that if they really wanted to go through with collecting the taxes, they would have to, you know, raise an army to collect these taxes and send it to the United States, which was quite an undertaking. And they backed down. The Parliament backed down about a month after the Stamp Act went into effect. It was withdrawn, but that sort of fervor, that idea, that realization that, you know, the colonies were really at the whim of Parliament and the Crown, really galvanized ultimate support for independence. And you see some of the press, you know, the Virginia Resolves, which is a statement of the Virginia legislature against the Stamp Act. It talks about taxation without representation. So we see the seeds of what would become the memes, if you would, of the revolution really start in the mid 1760s, and then an infrastructure is built, and then you know, from that, the Continental Congress begins to meet in 1775, and before it even votes for independence, it votes to create an independent postal system, right? They call it a constitutional post, so that they can distribute information without fear that the loyalist postal clerks would open their mail and would share it with authorities, and that the rebels would be charged with sedition. So the revolutionaries knew they needed a means of communication, and they needed to harness that technology, the printing press, in an effective and safe way, so that they could unite the colonies, as a nation against the crown. So there's a real connection between the technology and the means of communication even in the 18th century, and social change, and quite dramatic social change if we're talking about a revolution.
Yeah. Well, let me fast forward from the Stamp Act and the revolutionary times and talk a little bit about the risks of abuse from technology, and talk about the modern era. So the founders worried a lot about the state intervening and coming and quartering soldiers in your home, and going into your home and breaking into your papers. That was the word.
And effects, yes.
And so Fourth Amendment, all that. And so we've had hundreds of years of jurisprudence around what the scope of personal autonomy is. Today, we have technological means for keeping a bunch of information, either on a computer, on a disk, in the cloud. But the government has various means to intercept or read your papers. And so there are whole sets of laws and rules. And so there's been, over the last 10 years, a lot of focus on how to prevent abuses. And the current flavor is really around misinformation. That is, how do you protect people from falsehoods where they can get, frankly, spun up around something that's completely untrue? I'll use QAnon as the best example, where they assert that there's a frankly absurd satanic conspiracy that has, I'm not even going to repeat their claims. How do you balance the need for the government to protect its citizens against violence or insurrection on the one hand, which invites intrusions, and the need for sharing information within groups to advocate for social change? So it's kind of First Amendment, Fourth Amendment. How does that get played out in the context of giving advice to clients for lawyers? You've got, you're a corporate lawyer for Apple or Facebook. What kind of advice do you give them about where the law is and where it's going? And how do you ground that in history?
Well, clients should never use Gmail, right? So there are systems that are somewhat more secure. I think that there is no doubt that we have private companies, private entities that now have an ungodly amount of information about us. To date, there's been less infiltration of that data by the US government. We see it being utilized by other governments. Hong Kong, is an example. The protesters there, their private communications being hacked and being monitored. We saw a little bit of that in Portland. Journalists being tracked by the federal government. So the federal government has certainly awesome power, but also constraints. Private entities do not have the same constraints, and we sign over our consent to have them access that information. We give them that information. So I think that there are some systems that are sometimes considered more secure, like Signal and other apps for message apps. But it's very tricky. I'm not going to lie. We do have a sort of a private system that has all of the information that we might want to be kept private, and there's very thin forms of consent that we give these entities to share the information with third parties. An example of this is the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and we can, some people say it had a lot to do with, the Cambridge Analytica gave a lot of support to the Trump election bid in 2016. I think it's hard the jury's still out on what impact it actually had, but we know that from, I think it was about 300,000 individuals who had accessed a personality quiz, so ubiquitous a few years ago on Facebook, right? And from those 300,000 people accessing this personality quiz, it buried in the consents were consents not only to give the researcher the ability to look at those users' private pages on Facebook. It also gave that researcher consent to look at the private pages of all of the friends of those people who gave consent to and utilized this quiz. That opened the door to 87 million users of Facebook that Cambridge Analytica ultimately gained access to, because that researcher gave Cambridge Analytica the data that he had compiled. And then that data was then used by Cambridge Analytica, and we can just take the CEO of Cambridge Analytica at his word when he said that, they used that to support the Trump election bid. So there's this very thin line now between political activity being, put on Facebook, on other media platforms, and it getting into the hands of people who we don't want it to get into the hands of. And I think that's very, it's incredibly disconcerting and concerning for if people want to do something that may be unpopular, that they'll be afraid to do it, or that if they do it, that it will be revealed. So I think that there are great risks out there, and we can talk about some of the tools that we might have at our disposal to counteract them.
Yeah, well, sticking on the misinformation campaign. So let's say you're a lawyer and you're representing Procter & Gamble or Starbucks, and a rumor starts that your corporate logo is associated with devil worship. That's actually a real case. How do you go about understanding the technology and counteracting it? Obviously, there are litigation opportunities, Lanham Act, trademark, all that kind of stuff. But what kind of technological education do you need? And knowing, you referenced an app called Signal, which is an encrypted end-to-end tool, but it also could be used to organize people without you really ever knowing about it until it emerges in the sort of mainstream social media. So how do you prepare your clients for these new technologies? And some of it is protecting them in a cybersecurity way, but a lot of it is protecting them from opinions which may be false.
Yeah, it's very difficult with the old adage, a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. I think that there's, look at the, Save the Children, which is a, nonprofit group that's been around for decades. So the QAnon started using the hashtag Save the Children, and that affected the legitimate group. I think it's very difficult. Certainly our cybersecurity issues, brand management. There's a whole field of crisis management that people can utilize, but it is very difficult to counteract when something like that happens to a company. I really enjoy, there's a great paper out there entitled The Emperor's Dilemma, and it talks about how to overcome some of the disinformation and some of the silos that we can find ourselves in that lead to groupthink, and that if you get a piece of information that you may confirm your biases, right? Whether you support President Trump or Vice President Biden, confirm your biases. You may spread it, but there's a chance that it may not be true. And so one of the researchers recommend is when you find yourself with this sort of information and you're not quite sure whether it's true, you certainly can check the source and see if it seems to be a legitimate source. But you can also work with people who are in your broader network, not necessarily your immediate network, not necessarily the people who, agree with you 100% all of the time, but sort of fact check yourself by collaborating with people with whom you may not always agree with, and who you think are of goodwill, and you have goodwill towards them, and run it by them and say, hey, what do you think about this? Does this ring true to you? Do you see any holes in this fact or in this argument? So we do have tools, and ideally the platforms would be engaged in robust content moderation around misinformation, particularly misinformation that could lead to violence, misinformation around coronavirus. But we also have tools at our disposal. I mean, one of the wonderful things about about the platforms, social media platforms, is everyone has a platform. It's one of the great things about the social media platforms. One of the terrible things about the social media platforms is everyone has a platform, right? But we can be involved and engaged in trying to stem the influence of misinformation by, finding people who we trust, who may not see eye to eye with us, and have conversations with them, share information with them, and maybe they'll share information back with us, and we'll help to maybe learn something new or point out misinformation in the information that they have at their disposal. So there are there are technologies that the companies have a role to play in this, but we also have a role to play in it as well.
Sure. I don't know, Jeffrey, are there any questions pending in the chat room?
We do not have any questions yet, but we are monitoring it. And actually, we were just going to put it in the chat again, just to remind people we are going to be taking questions. So go ahead and put it in there now.
Yeah, otherwise, those of you who are muted are going to get called on to ask questions.
Absolutely, do some cold calling.
Chris and Alicia and David out there, so just be prepared, you're going to get called on. Ray, I want to talk a little bit about a theme from your book, which is about social capital. And so my question is, without getting too pointy-headed, so you cite and go into great length about Robert Putnam in Bowling Alone, and in juxtaposition, de Tocqueville, Democracy in America. So in broad strokes, what is social capital, and how is it built by person-to-person interaction and creating senses of community that sustain the social fabric that's America?
So social capital is an idea that's been kicking around for about a century, but really popularized by Robert Putnam's landmark work, Bowling Alone, I think published in 2000. Social capital sort of comes down to, my definition of social capital is a simple one. It's networked trust. And when you have a network, you can't have a network of one. You need to have at least two people in a network, and preferably more than that. But it's the idea that by collaborating with others, by seeing people on the soccer pitch, watching the kids play soccer, at a local bar, at a local union hall, seeing people, having face-to-face interactions with them, communicating with them, you start to build relationships and you start to build trust. And those relationships of trust can be leveraged for collaborative, cooperative action. Putnam's book is I think is great. He's got a new one coming out in days. I suspect he's going to try and update it a little bit for the social media age. But I think that some of the data he looks at and sort of saying that communities where social capital is high seem to thrive. There's more economic activity. There's communities are safer. Mark Granovetter, a couple in the 70s came out with this idea of the strength of weak ties. The idea that we advance ourselves more in terms of finding better jobs, getting better opportunities, finding better information when we connect with people who are not in our immediate circle, but that those sort of weak tie relationships. And I think that one of the downsides of the sort of top-down model of community organizing, that model that we see with the computerized mailing list, is you don't build that social capital. You don't build that network of trust that can be leveraged for advancing change. And so going back to some of your earlier questions, I think social capital is a critical component of advocacy. When I was a lawyer in working in housing court in New York City, the tenant associations I represented were, they were rich in social capital, of bonding social capital, but they didn't have another kind of social capital called bridging social capital, where you connect with, the broader community, and to advance the interests of your group. And in some ways, I played that bridge for them, is that I was access to the legal system, right, as a lawyer. And so that bonding social capital they shared amongst each other could be then advanced through the bridging social capital that I and others brought to the table, to advance their interests. And I think that sort of use of and appreciation for social capital is something I hope people will take away from the book, that the technology can build social capital, but can also take away social capital. And we'll see, you talked about gun reform, another organization is Moms Demand Action, and they are using they're using social media to build local chapters of Moms Demand Action, where the members come together, build that trust. They're forming around an issue they all care about, and then they're connecting it to the broader network of the Moms Demand Action network to try to leverage change both locally and nationally. And so they're building that social capital with technological tools, but then they're leveraging that social capital to advance social change.
David, we do have a comment and a question from the chat. This one's actually to you, David, from Professor Mike Hutter. He's commenting that, from your perspective I'll say 50 years ago, after your graduation from the law school. That's his comment, not mine. He's asking a really great question, because we do have our law school students, listening in this week. He's wondering about courses that law students should consider taking to acquire the necessary background to deal with the matters that you and Professor Brescia are dealing with. What are some courses you think you might like to see at the law school, David? And Dean Willett is listening as well.
Well, I'm going to ask the dean to comment first. Alicia?
See if we get Alicia to comment on the types of courses. There she is.
Hi, I'm not allowed to start my video for some reason, but hi, thank you for the excellent discussion. I just got permission. Let's see. Did that work?
We can see you.
So I'd start by saying take Ray's courses. He's got a lot of courses in innovation and actually putting a lot of what we're talking about to the test. But I think it's also important to just know for students to really understand the levers of change in the law. So things like administrative law, while perhaps not something that seems super interesting or sexy to law students, is understanding the regulatory state is an absolute key to change. And then any courses involving advocacy, because that's a large part of what we're talking about. So, but I do wonder what our panelists, what advice the panelists would give on the same question.
Yeah, well, thank you. I have 3 suggestions. One is learn about behavioral economics. The ability to nudge behavior by using positive and negative incentives is a field that didn't exist in any fundamental way when I was in law school, and has emerged over really the last 20 years. It's produced a number of Nobel Prizes in economics, and the people who won were not necessarily economists. So the book that I would recommend is Nudge by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. Second is getting to yes, the art of negotiating. If you do not know how to think about the art of negotiating, you're going to be a less good lawyer because everything's about negotiating. And my third suggestion is really kind of a life one, but should start in law school. Get involved with something beyond yourself. Become part of a community. We face a lot of challenges as a country with deaths of despair, increases in suicide rate, addiction, fear, lack of trust in government. Those things can only be dealt with if there's a human connection. And I think that's one of the points of Ray's book. You cannot just use technology from a distance. You actually have to know other human beings, know their stories, their trials, their travails, in order to be an effective citizen and as an effective lawyer. Lawyers are well respected as leaders in whatever community they're in, and knowing that community and participating and adding value. And again, that can start in law school, and the law school has some great clinics. It almost doesn't make any difference what clinic you participate in. Do as many as you can, because you want to run into and have a relationship with people outside your immediate social circle so that you can learn more and add value. Ray, you want to comment?
I couldn't agree more. I think get involved. The clinics are great ways to get involved. Through our Justice Center, working in the community through externships, taking courses on cybersecurity and privacy that touch upon some of these issues that we've been talking about. The sky's the limit, right? Like there's so many things that you can do. Really it matters less what you do, but that you get involved and that you get involved in things that you care passionately about and understand, in a controlled environment, if you would, start to get exposed to the things that you care about and the ways that you can try to advance change in those areas.
We have one comment in the chat room asking for a link to the presentation for the people who attended. So I'm assuming, Jeffrey, you can arrange that. Well, Ray, we're coming up on somewhere close to the end here, and I want to give you an opportunity to say a few things, and then I'll ask you one last question after you make some remarks. First, where do you buy the book? And will you autograph it?
The book is available wherever books are sold. You can get it on Amazon. It's published by Cornell University Press. I don't know that we've actually given the title. It's The Future of Change, How Technology Shapes Social Revolutions. I can show you that the cover is fantastic, although it's going to come back in a negative, if you can see it. Oh, no, you can't see it. Hold on a second. It's a great cover, I think. It keeps bouncing me off. Hold on a second. Maybe Alicia has it handy. But here's the cover. Really fun. You can see it in negative, but it wouldn't have happened without the support of the law school. Just simply put, there's no way I could have done something like this on my own. I had a team of experts, law students, colleagues. I mean, you can, if you get the book, and yes, I will sign it, but if you get the book and just read the acknowledgments, the number of faculty who helped with earlier drafts, with moral support, the students who read drafts, who proofread, who helped with following the Chicago Manual of Style as opposed to the Blue Book, just a great team of experts that supported me. Dean Willett, could not have happened without your support over the many years it took to write it. We would often commiserate about how long and how hard it is to put a book together. so thank you for that. In addition, just the institutional support, which really comes from all of you in the community, the broader Albany Law faculty, Albany Law community, the alums who support the school in so many ways, whether it's coming to campus to teach and speak to our students or financially. The support of the law school, which is really, it's all of the community holding us up. That's how something like this happens, and it would not have happened without all of that support, day in, day out, from the computer tech folks to my legal assistant Sherry Meyer, and everyone in between, the library, everybody. It's a team effort at the law school in everything that we do, and the support from the alums and the broader family makes it all possible. And I thank you because this is, for me, this was a professionally probably the most difficult but also rewarding thing that I've ever done. And it would not have happened without all of your support. So thank you.
Okay, well, I think just one last question. If you had an era in the history of the events that you're talking about, what was the most exciting use of technology, starting with the printing press, the Stamp Act, the Postal Service, the telegraph, the telephone, radio, television, the internet? Which one would you prefer to do and why? Why would you want to be alive in that era? And if you want to pick a role that you could have played, go ahead.
That's a great question. I opened the book with the story of the American Legion's effort to get the GI Bill passed. And I think of that effort as so remarkable and so exciting. And they used, every tool at their disposal, every technological tool at their disposal, the mails, the telegraph, the telephone, the radio. They had, those old, was it Movie Tone News? They had the film clips in the theaters supporting the GI Bill. And what they did was they told the American people that the returning GIs, we owed a debt to them. And we needed to support them so that they could reintegrate into society. And they were so careful about ensuring that everyone who served in the armed services, whether they saw combat, regardless of their gender, everyone who served in the armed services could get some assistance through the GI Bill. And the GI Bill, Peter Drucker called the GI Bill the most important event of the 20th century. It transformed the United States. In the late 40s, roughly 50% of all people in higher education, all students in higher education, were getting benefits under the GI Bill. And so I think that notion, that debt that we owe, and I think to today, and the essential workers, from grocery store workers to food delivery to janitorial staff to healthcare workers, the folks who are just developing a vaccine, God willing, the nation owes them a great debt. And I'm hopeful that we will, when we come out of this, and God willing we will, that we will rethink how we value work in the United States. And so that, to me, that was such an exciting effort and such an exciting example of the effective use of technology, but coupled with a grassroots campaign, 12,000 chapters of the American Legion, and the technology that they used, all forms of technology to spread the word that we're in this together. And I would hope that we'll address, the current cataclysm we're facing in the same way.
Well, thank you, Ray. Just one point of personal privilege. I'll take less than a minute. When Justice Ginsburg died, I called my daughter, who's a young lawyer, and I was in despair, to be frank. And she said, "Dad, we can't despair. Your grandson has to have hope." And the two issues I would call out that I'm hopeful we will do something about are addressing racial inequities and racial justice issues and climate change. And so for the lawyers who are going to be around in the coming decades, the ability to use technology to organize and make progress on those two issues gives me a sense of optimism. And I hope that people learn the lessons from Ray's book in pursuing those goals. So with that, thank you.
Thank you.
Jeffrey, yours?
Yes, thank you very, very much. Thank you very much, Professor Brescia. Again, the name of the book is The Future of Change. And as Ray points out, you can get it anywhere books are sold. And we really appreciate, Ray, for you taking the time and speaking to our alumni, our students, our faculty and staff today. It's been wonderful. David, thank you for doing this for us and for the myriad of things that you have assisted your law school with this year. We sincerely appreciate you taking the time this morning out there for being with us. We sincerely appreciate it. Thank you very much. Just housekeeping for the people on the call. President and Dean Alicia Willett will deliver the State of the School address, which is on Friday at 4 o'clock Eastern. We will invite you all right now to please join us. If you would like to sign up and participate, you can go to our alumni website at Albany Law and find out more details on that. But do try to participate in the State of the School, 4 o'clock on Friday. That's it. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.